Hi, everybody. I'm pleased to have with me here today one of the authors of the BCO's Designing for Neurodiversity report, Araceli Camargo. On episode 6 of Talking Shop with the NextGen, we will be discussing all things neurodiversity in the workplace. Araceli is a lead scientist at Centric Lab and a cognitive neuroscientist focused on how people interact with the urban environment. Araceli is of Turtle Island descent and holds an MSc in cognitive neuroscience from King's College London. Araceli, what inspired you to write the report, Designing for Neurodiversity?
Crass answer, we were hired to.
Well, you can say that, that's absolutely fine.
But no, this has been a while in the making. I am neurodiverse myself, and a lot of people in our team are as well. So it is something that is very close to who we are as scientists and who we are as people. So that, I think, gave us the impetus to anchor words like justice and empathy and equity into the document and ensure that we were anchoring it in a different mode away from just productivity. So I think that was the inspiration. When we spoke to the BCO team, they were very open and happy for us to take that angle. And so then that, of course, gave us a lot of motivation to write the report that we did. It is, as you have probably skimmed it, it's a very robust, very thick report, really delving deep into the mechanisms of the science, but also the history of the movement, which is what neurodiversity is. It's a movement, as well as what are the social, cognitive, and health consequences of not being inclusive of people who are neurodiverse.
That's really interesting because, I mean, you described yourself as neurodiverse and also saying about it being a community and a movement. And, you know, I think the takeaway is that this is not a diagnosis. Could you just elaborate a little bit and maybe reference some of the conditions that fall under a neurodiversity umbrella that we as designers, myself as an architect, should be thinking about when designing spaces?
Yes, of course. So neurodiversity is an umbrella term to describe mainly a civil rights movement. So it is, how do you gain access, or how do you provide, access to people that are, and I will go into the different components of neurodiversity, people access to resources being healthcare and being part of a community, but also, of course, employment. And one of the things that we anchored in the report is that due to how our society is organized, employment is a cornerstone to the participation in every aspect of society, right? It allows you to, or it affords you specialized healthcare. It affords you specialized interventions of well-being, food. Even where you live is also influenced by your employment and economic status. So having pathways to enable people that are in the neurodiverse spectrum to come into and participate in economics is a question of a human right. So, and that was always the intention of having that classification as neurodiversity, because of course we cannot, one of the tenets of human rights is that you have to have an identity, you have to have an identification. It's both a hindrance and also it is also a help, right? Because it's a hindrance because also a lot of people don't like the term neurodiversity, or they want to start changing what neurodiversity includes. And so, but we do need something to identify in order to go and ask for the people that are not neurotypical, which is another terminology. There has to be avenues for them to be able to access equitable paths to resources. So there is the neurodiversity, which is the movement. There is being neurodiverse or neurodivergent, which is in reference to the person, and there's being non-neurotypical. So non-neurotypical as in you're not falling into the usual scientific, I should say, scope of what you would say is a normal cognitive function. Now, arguably, we can have a discussion on what is normal, which is one of the discussion points in the neurodiversity movement of can we really put a pin on what's normal? And if we can't, then how are we saying what's abnormal and what's not? And maybe the better or more accurate way to talk about it is environments that are enabling or disabling, which is also in the report, right? So is it a question that someone, because they are not neurotypical, and let's say they have dyspraxia, which affects your sensory motor function, and you cannot go up a steep set of flight stairs with no railing? Is that because you're neurotypical, or is that because that design is disabling, right? It's white, so you can't see the differentiation between the steps. There's no indication of where one step ends and another one begins, which when you have dyspraxia can be very difficult to have also a sense of your person in space.
Yeah.
And if there is no railing because you're going for a very specific aesthetic, and that person can't go up those stairs, again, that's not the person who is disabled. It is the environment that is disabling, and that has nothing to do really with the person being not being neurotypical. That just is a very difficult staircase to climb. And the other side as well to that argument is that even for people that may consider themselves neurotypical, more than likely are going to trip on that type of staircase, because it isn't great for human cognition to have, like I'm thinking about the staircases in particular at the British Library, where right, and so that's another addition to the conversation that is now, which is a lot more recent, that whilst yes, we have to identify and say these people are neurodivergent, we also have to acknowledge that most of the time those differences, as they were, are coming from the fact that most environments are incredibly disabling. And then to your point of the types that go into it, in terms of the definition of the movement, it includes anybody that has a different way of sensing, as in the senses, and perceiving and attaining to the world. So what you are paying attention in your environment. So that includes historically dyspraxia, which is, as I said, it's a motor sensory deficiency. There is autism, which is a humongous spectrum that goes from being what we call high functioning, which is a person that can be in a conversation, they are employed or employable, but also all the way to people that have it with comorbidities such as cerebral palsy, that are nonverbal, that are also having multiple sensorial differences. So it is a very, very huge spectrum. And then you have ADHD, which has to do with the way that different the way that our brain attains to, like, what it and how it is paying attention to the environment. It's not just as simple as saying, oh, I have ADHD, so I don't pay attention to nothing. It's not that. You are still paying attention, and in many cases you're paying very acute attention to certain elements in the environment, but it's how the brain is doing it and to what it is attaining to that is the difference. So for example, the usual is that you would attain to salient stimuli, so stimuli that is coming in that is new. For somebody with ADHD, that salience filter may not be there. So i.e. everything is salient. So you're constantly looking up, if you're sitting in an office space, it could be that the door goes, the elevator door opens, you have a colleague passing through you, and you're paying attention to every single thing. Or you might be another type of the ADHD spectrum is that you're paying very acute attention to a task. So you really submerge yourself into a task, and then everything else goes into the periphery. So when we were interviewing for the report, we actually got told by somebody who has that in their spectrum of ADHD is that they have to be, or they prefer being in an environment where they are prompted to leave the desk, because otherwise they will be there all day. And of course, when you look at it from a productivity lens, people will think, oh, well, that person's doing fantastic. They've been glued at their desk and focused and working for the last 8 hours with the misunderstanding that that person may not have the ability to just go, actually, I'm going to go and focus on something else, i.e. getting some food, getting some water. And so you need to be in an environment where that is either provided as a, there are prompts in the environment that give you, or you have, more a facility of being able to have the prompt for you to go, oh yeah, I need to get up and hydrate myself or eat or just move away from the desk. And then there is also dyslexia, which again, it's a huge spectrum. It's not just about switching letters or not being able to spell very well. In my case, it influences my memory. It influences, again, how I attain and perceive the world, what I'm actually focusing on. And it also affects your motor skills. It affects your linguistic skills, and it also can affect the way that you are actually puzzling and thinking about things. The way that you mentally order things can be very different in someone with dyslexia. So dyslexics are for one of the tell signs is never knowing where your keys are, or misplacing various different items, as well as getting lost. So all of that goes within the dyslexia umbrella. And then there is Tourette's. We argue in the document that we should also, because it is a question of sensorial differences or attaining to the environment differently, that we should include things like depression and anxiety, because when we are in those states, we too are also perceiving and attaining to the world differently. So there is a very well-known study with people with experiencing depression, where they are scanning faces very differently. So where they scan, where they pay attention to parts of the face are very different. So then their social cognition is very different. They tend to perceive people they disproportionately perceive people as being sad or upset versus happy or joyful or any of those types of emotions. But also they miss a lot of social cues because they're not paying attention to the eyes, for example, or to other facial expressions that can tell them the story of what that person's mental health state is, or what that person's emotional state is. So it changes the way that you are perceiving the world. And there's also moments where, quote unquote, neurotypical people, if you go through a loss, if you're going through an anxiety because you are feeling the tension of a deadline, or maybe you have had something catastrophic happen in your personal life, that all of a sudden that means that you are in a state of feeling worried, or you might have tipped over to a diagnosis of anxiety. Again, if you are in that acute high stress mode, you are changing the way that you are perceiving and attaining the world around you, which you will need different type of support. That at the moment, basically, it's not only that environments are disabling to people that are neurotypical, is that they are really made for one modality. Even for the people that are neurotypical, you just have to be in this modality of being completely mentally, cognitively, emotionally, spiritually balanced to be able to interact. I think most of us can have the experience where we are stressed, and we enter a noisy room, and maybe the noisy room didn't bother you yesterday, but all of a sudden it does, and you're very sensitive to it. And so we are also added that into the document, that yes, we need this civil rights movement for people who are not neurotypical, but we must also understand that the rest of the population is we're humans, we're not machines. As much as people love that analogy that the brain is a machine, it is not a machine. It is a sensorial, phenomenological experience. Activity really is what the brain is. It's an activity, it's a process. And it isn't stagnant, and it isn't always in the same point. And so we don't allow that in the environment. We don't have that flexibility to go. Sometimes we enter the building in a great state, and sometimes we enter buildings in a poor state.
It's really interesting because you've talked there about a massive range of diagnosis, from something which is very disabling to like things that happen in your lives that can cause you to sort of have elements of that. And I suppose the sort of key message is is it roughly 1 in 7 people are neurodiverse as such, and that within they struggle within the widest sort of employee ecosystem, but also within spaces. And from what you're saying, it sounds like there is stuff that could be designed differently, but also it's a cultural thing within a workspace. And is there a way that you see an overlap between workspace design and how people are sort of treated culturally in a workspace, and how organizations work around people's neurodiversity? Or is it more of a case of you have to treat each person individually and you have to cope with their sort of their own issues as they arise?
I mean, it's both. So again, in the research and also in speaking to people, the number one thing that they stated as a mitigator or a variable of whether they were going to be okay, which I will define what okay means, and not being okay, is the culture that they were in. So if they were in a very supportive culture, they were able to cope with a design that was less than enabling for them. You have both a culture that doesn't support you and a culture and also design that doesn't support you. Where do you go? And that's when things start to not be okay. So let's go into a little bit. So in terms of supportive culture, being listened to and not being dismissed, a lot of people that were in our interview process experienced everything from completely being ignored, so not being acknowledged when they were trying to voice, being railroaded, and in a meeting setting, to not even having the ability to access someone in charge to say, I need this change in the environment, or I need this, or I need that, and to, okay, you were listened to, and there's a space for you to come and express what you're feeling, but then you're infantilized. And your emotions, your thoughts are all treated like you are a child, and you cannot have, you don't deserve the governance over your own environment. So things like the way, when somebody described it, that the way that they would speak to them was like, well, I do understand language. I don't know why you're speaking to me in a tone as if I was a child. And then the other one is, of course, the very famous thing that we have in our culture, which is gaslighting. So that included things like this person saying, I can't go into that meeting room because it's striped and it gives me nausea. And the people were always like, that's ridiculous. How can I give you nausea? Okay, well, then just don't face it. And he's like, it's not a question of not facing it. And also, when I'm talking about nausea, you're talking what he was actually going through biologically was a sense of like a type of vertigo, that his brain would get so disorientated that it would cause the room to spin because of the stripes in the room, that would then cause him to feel that sense of nausea and needing to vomit. I mean, that is, your body panics, your body's stress response immediately ignites and tells you you are in danger, you are in trouble, things are not okay. And that can cause a panic attack, which can be, again, a very quick, oh, I can't breathe, I can calm myself down, to it feels like a heart attack and like I can't breathe and like I need to go to the hospital. So that's what I mean by not okay. These are very intricate and complex biological changes that are happening to somebody when we don't listen to them. It's not just a discomfort. It's not just a question of making small changes, or somebody saying, I'm not quite comfortable. And that's where that sense of infantilization, ignoring, and gaslighting comes in, because I don't think the general public understands that there is physiological, biological changes that are happening in real time, but equally can have a long-term debilitating effect. And again, we describe those in more detail in the report, because out of all the things that we talked about with the interviewees, that's one of the things that they wanted to impart was, this is going beyond a state where you can just be like, okay, well, go and sit down away from the meeting for 5 minutes and then come back. Sometimes that does help, but it is real medical support that people need after certain incidents like this. Because can you imagine if that keeps happening over time, like I said, with the person in the meeting room, if that happens day in and day out, but then also you start to build a fear, right? A fear of anticipation that you're going to go into that room, you're not going to be listened to, you're going to be very uncomfortable, you're going to feel very unsafe, and eventually that starts to affect you outside of work, where you begin to have anxiety or worry at the anticipation of going to work, which can mean that you are not sleeping then well at night. You might not even be socializing in the way that you usually do, because you start to get depressed, right? Because you start to feel disempowered. You add that up and you reach things like burnout, which we give a whole chapter about.
Yeah.
And burnout isn't just, oh, I couldn't cope. It is, again, a set of physiological, biological changes that happen. And most of the time, people, especially who are on the neurodiverse spectrum, after a burnout, they can go into deep depressions, which then puts them out of employment for a very long time, as they have to really go into a rehabilitation type process.
So it sounds to me that the sort of environment can create a very disabling workplace, and that it's a culture. It's very much a culture in how people treat people within workspace, but also there clearly is something about creating safer spaces that are more enabling. And you talked about the meeting room example, where you would come into a space and have issue. It would be a environmental thing, but also a social issue that would create these create people to sort of have sort of stress and anxiety around that space. And I'm just wondering, is there different ways we could treat environments, different ways to design spaces that could soften that to, so for example, a typical meeting room is quite small and tight and you might feel very claustrophobic within it, but is there things that we could do to create a more enabling space?
So that's where it goes into the individual side, which you were talking about. The recommendations that we put in, and I am overstepping because this is now the realms of the designers who we worked with, which was PLP, but also Luke, who is also neurodiverse and a designer. The range of the recommendations, the tendency for universalities around design are not helpful.
Yeah.
Because again, they're not helpful for neurotypical people, and they're not helpful for people who are neurodivergent, because again, the human body, as any living being, is moment to moment changing. So what used to be something that was comfortable, right? We see it in a chair. We all shift and move in chairs. Why? Because the position that we were sitting in for 5 minutes no longer is comfortable. As our muscles tighten around that position, as our blood flow changes, or, the other way around, our blood flow changes, which changes our muscle, and we go, oh, that's no longer comfortable because I'm not getting blood to that part of my body. So we shift and we move. And that is just a constant dialogue. The same thing with our breathing. Our breathing adjusts all the time, depending if we're standing up, if we're sitting down, our blood pressure. So this is a very, very, very dynamic, moment to moment, second to second, a set of activities that are constantly happening, met with complete stagnation. Right? Nothing moves in the built environment. Lights are the same, temperature is the same, chair is the same, desk is the same, just this absolute wall of inertia. So if you meet a set of activity with the opposite, with a lot of momentum, a lot of change, with this wall of inertia, it's never going to be a compatible relationship. So what we were saying in the report is move away from universalities to go, oh, and they love it, right? That was one of our greatest critiques of other reports on this, is that they love discovering the silver bullet of, like, if you have this light, bam, people with anxiety are going to be okay. People with ADHD are going to be okay. But the retina is constantly changing. I mean, for example, I on a side note, I used to be a theater stage manager and producer in another lifetime. One of the things that stuck over to the science bit is that in a play that was, you had to actually keep the same lighting. We constantly had to keep changing the light densities and the illumination, because the retina gets fatigued. So if we just kept the same exact lighting through the entire play, because what they call straight plays, so plays that are dramatic, and you're just dealing with one set, you couldn't keep the same lighting because of retina fatigue. We already were looking at that kind of stuff, and so you constantly had to keep subtly adding light cues, because people were like, otherwise it's going to go flat to the eye. So imagine knowing that in a space like theater, but in the work environment, we're like, no, let's nail it with this type of light. But you're like, but okay, but why don't we learn to, light is going to need to change depending on our circadian rhythm, because our bodies very much react to light. It's a wave, and our bodies react to this wave. And so it's going to need to change probably throughout the day. But again, if you are having bouts of high stress, this is the commonality across all humans, neurotypical or not, if you're coming through a bout of high stress, a light that was really good yesterday might be too acute for you today. So how do you build in flexibility? How do you make the built environment more alive, right? More human, or I should say more of a being that can be adapted, that can be flexible, that can be responsive. And it doesn't have to be through a whole bunch of technology, because also when we say that, immediately people go to, oh, so you mean AI? And it's not. Like, responsive can mean that you have chairs that can move from one room to another, that you have walls that can be sometimes put in, sometimes taken out. And also little things like having a room that is almost neutral, where a person can use that for prayer or a little bit of yoga, because maybe you just need to stretch, can use it for meditation, and somebody who's not neurotypical can use it to sensorially recalibrate, right? Where they can either put the sensorial experience up, like for example, listening to music, or they can bring the sensorial experience right down. And that just allows for a little bit of balance, for a little bit of healing to happen within the day of the workspace, to go back out and deal with the meetings and the interactions, et cetera, et cetera. But we don't have that. And that, again, is so simple, so small, but it goes back to your bit of culture that we think universality. We have to have a meeting room that does this, this, and this, and then it doesn't do the very, almost very fundamental or rudimentary human thing, which is just to allow somebody just to be, to relax, to calm down, et cetera.
Really interesting, because one of my sort of final questions was going to be about how designers need to be thinking more about workplace, but actually it seems to me that we kind of need to take a step back instead of over designing things. And we're saying about different lighting strategies and creating soft space, having just simple spaces for people with the range of neurodiversity we've talked about to go and deal with an issue in a different way is probably the way to go. So with that in mind, is there any sort of key messaging that you would give to people who have issues in workspace now? Let's say that they haven't got the most modern workplace, they haven't got the best environment to work in, but is there things that they can do to make their lives maybe better on a day-to-day basis within an office environment?
I mean, a big thing that we talk about is that health is ecological. So whilst, yes, of course, there are things that I will go through them, that I do personally, and then everybody will find their own personal way. And we do, right? Because we exist, and by we, I mean those of us who are not neurotypical. We exist at a very great cost to our health, but we do exist in the workplace, and we've been adapting and coping. But this is where the justice thing comes in. We shouldn't have to do that. We shouldn't expect people to have to do that. We should already be thinking in an enabling environment. And also, sorry, I wanted to add something else to the enabling bit, that we go, and we say in America, really hoity-toity on like all these specs, but they're simple things, like, for example, we don't have clean air in offices. Offices are notorious, all offices, I don't care if you're Google or you're Goldman Sachs with all your, bells and whistles. We don't have clean air in offices. Clean air is fundamental for human health, cognition, beingness, regardless of where you are on the spectrum. And let's start with that. Let's start with getting people some clean air, getting people access to nourishment in the office, which goes to, to the cultural side, and giving people, like I said, access, all people. Because also one of the things that we put into the report is that now in these very fancy offices, there's cafeterias and there are, places where you can go and get coffee. Those people that are working in the cafeteria and the coffee space and are cleaning part of the hygiene staff, there are also people within that grouping that are neurodiverse. And where is their place for calm? Where is their access to that rooftop garden? So we have to be really cognizant. From a designer, one of the things that we put is that we have to make these spaces democratic, these spaces of healing, whether it's the rooftop or the meditation room, whatever. They have to have democratic use. We can't live in this stupid, and it is stupid, hierarchy like that, and classism within the workspace is stupid. It's not the way that society should be organized. Should be democratic. And we can't talk about being a democratic society when even in a microcosm of the workspace, we don't have it, right? So we do need to have those affordances. So then we can do the individualized work. So one of the things that I do as I'm sitting down and almost on a constant basis is doing very deep breathing, because that alone is an anti-inflammatory, creates an anti-inflammatory response, which brings down the inflammation, brings down the stress, brings down the stress hormones. So the other symptomology that is attached to a dyslexia and sensorial differences that I have can calm down, because I know that when I'm stressed and I feel overwhelmed, all of that symptomology becomes more acute. It's like my brain just begins to go into a fog / a shutdown when I'm under high stress. And everybody does that. It's just I get there quicker than possibly the next person. And reminding myself to take a deep breath as I'm sitting down, also making sure that my posture is correct. So when I take the deep breath goes completely into my body and into all of my organs. But as I said, the caveat there is that I have to be given clean air in order for that deep breath to actually work, right? You can't tell people go and do deep breaths, but also take deep breaths of carbon monoxide, because we're right next to a very busy street. And also there's a whole bunch of artificial materiality in this office that is going to be spewing out air toxins into the air. So if we are going to, like I said, tell people to take a deep breath in, we have to give them clean air to take, to intake. Another big one is, but again, you have to have that space, is that I have to go recalibrate somewhere. That's what I call it for myself. I call it, it's not a technical neuroscientific term, I just call it recalibration, where I have to completely decompress sensorially. So I need a dark room, no noise, to be on my own, to do my meditation. And there I go into deeper breathing or some yoga. But again, I need a room also with the dignity that provides me that ability, right? So there was a person that we interviewed who asked for such a room, and they got given a cupboard with stuff still in the cupboard. That's not dignity. And that it was even worse for him, because there was, I can't remember exactly what the sensorial experience was of all the things that were in the cupboard, not to mention that it was small and hot and unventilated. And so the employer can't then just be like, oh, I'm washing my hands, I gave you the cupboard, why aren't you okay? Right? We have to, like I said, that added dignity, that space really is a space for that person to be able to do it. And then of course the final thing is that access to nature, that when I have been around offices, if I am on a rooftop where there is nature, or in a garden or a courtyard where I can actually hear nature, the sounds of birds and see trees, and have that calmness that comes with nature. Again, this is personal to me. There are other people that might find that annoying, but that sound of nature is very soothing to me, and having access to that really helps bring down everything from the cortisol to the blood pressure, and I can decompress. But I have to have access to that, right? So like I said, the individual always exists within an ecosystem.
I think it's all fascinating. And what I'm taking away from this is there's a lot more that we need to ask the questions rather than just thinking there's an answer. And I think that comes through very clearly in the Designing for Neurodiversity report. Here's a series of questions we should be asking along the process of design, which I think clearly there's no right answer. And, for yourself, you have a personal take on how you deal with things, but I have a different take, and other people have different ways of dealing with things. And I think that's what we have to be cognizant of. I'm afraid that, Araceli, that is time for today. It was fantastic speaking to you. Again, I'd encourage everybody to go read the BCO Designing for Neurodiversity report, which is available to all members. And I just want to say again, thank you, Araceli. Great to meet you, and all the best. Thank you.